All right, diving into another day's worth of news. And wow, you guys weren't kidding about this one being a wild ride. Kenya, October 8th, 2024. Where do we even start?
Buckle up, because this day is a crash course in Kenyan politics, that's for sure.
No kidding. Right off the bat, we're hit with the news about Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua facing impeachment. 281 MPs voting in favor. That's got to be some kind of record, right?
It's definitely significant, that's for sure. That number sails past the 233 votes needed to send this whole thing to the Senate.
Right, the Senate. For those of us who maybe haven't been following every twist and turn of Kenyan politics, what's the Senate's role in all this?
Think of them as the jury in this whole impeachment trial. They're the ones who'll ultimately decide Gachagua's fate.
High stakes. And the accusations against him, this MP, Mwengi Mutuse, is bringing up some serious allegations. Corruption, misconduct in office, even trying to undermine President Ruto himself.
Yeah, and you can't forget about the claims of Gachagua stirring up ethnic tensions, which is a whole other can of worms in Kenyan politics.
It's like a powder keg waiting to go off. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break down these accusations. This whole thing about Gachagua's wealth, it's a central part of the story, right?
Absolutely. It's a major point of contention. Mutuse is claiming that Gachagua's amassed a fortune, something like shesh 5.2 billion, and he's saying a lot of it was obtained through shady means, potentially even involving his sons.
So we're talking about good old-fashioned corruption allegations here.
Pretty much. But Gachagua's fighting back, claiming most of his wealth is inherited. He says it comes from his brother, the former governor of Neria. According to Gachagua, he's just managing his late brother's estate, which includes some pretty high-profile properties like the Olive Garden Hotel and Vipingo Beach Hotel.
But Mutis isn't buying it.
Not one bit. He's raising questions about how Gachagua's sons factor into all of this, suggesting they might be involved in some of these questionable business dealings that Mutis keeps allaying to.
So it becomes a question of who to believe. On the one hand, you've got Gachagua presenting himself as a successful businessman, claiming he's being unfairly targeted.
And on the other hand, you've got Mutuse, who's painting a picture of a guy who's potentially been using his family and business connections to, well, let's just say bend the rules a bit.
To put it mildly.
To put it mildly.
And it's not just about the money, is it? This whole thing gets even murkier when you bring in Gachagua's claims about President Ruto. He's literally pointing fingers at the president, saying this whole impeachment thing is a scheme to push him out of power.
It really makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes, right? Like, how deep does this rabbit hole go? It really throws the stability of the entire government into question.
Exactly. It's like watching a house of cards, waiting to see which way the wind will blow next.
And that's the thing about this whole situation. Regardless of what the Senate ultimately decides, the damage is kind of already done. This entire impeachment process, it raises huge questions about the integrity of Kenya's leadership and whether or not Ruto can even effectively lead with all of this going on.
And it's like this cloud of uncertainty hangs over everything else happening that day. Like even when you look at the economic news, it's not exactly a walk in the park either.
No, not at all. You've got the Central Bank of Kenya. They decided to cut interest rates, which on the surface you might think, okay, that's good news for anyone looking to take out a loan.
Yeah, I mean, lower interest rates usually translate to cheaper borrowing, don't they?
Yeah.
So good for the economy, right?
Well, yeah, it's not always that simple. This whole rate cut thing was sparked by a drop in inflation, which, again, might sound like a good thing initially, but sometimes it can be a sign of a slowing economy, which brings a whole other set of problems to the table.
It's like they're trying to walk a tightrope, trying to find that sweet spot between encouraging growth and keeping things stable at the same time.
Exactly.
And speaking of trying to find opportunities in the middle of all this uncertainty, there's this news about the U.S. offering up a bunch of diversity visas, specifically for Kenyans, something like 3,850 of them. What do you make of that, given everything else that's going on in the country at the time?
It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? It's like, on one hand, you've got this potential way out for Kenyans who are struggling economically or maybe feeling disillusioned with the political situation. But on the other hand, it just underscores the very real struggles that a lot of people are dealing with in their own country.
It makes you think about all those individual stories behind those visa applications, the dreams, the anxieties, the tough choices people are having to make.
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that we need to look beyond those big national headlines sometimes and zoom in on some of the local stories that don't always get as much attention.
Because those are the stories that really give you a sense of how all these bigger forces are actually playing out in people's everyday lives. Like that tragic story about the student who was killed during a protest at Bungoma National Polytechnic. It's just heartbreaking and a stark reminder of the kind of unrest that continues to plague Kenyan educational institutions.
And it's not just about that one incident. It speaks to these deeper issues like access to affordable education, the quality of those institutions, and just a general sense of frustration among young people who feel like they're being denied opportunities.
And sadly, this Bungoma incident, it's not an isolated case, is it? You see echoes of that same frustration in the story about the Kericho governor, Eric Mutai. He's facing impeachment hearings over these allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse of power.
Yeah, it goes to show that those issues of corruption and accountability that we talked about with Gachagua, they're present at every level of government. In fact, the article about Mutai even mentions a whole string of impeachments targeting county officials all across Kenya, which suggests that maybe this is part of a much larger reckoning that's been brewing for a while.
It's like everyone's holding a mirror up to the entire political system, and what they're seeing is a pattern of misconduct that just can't be ignored any longer.
Yeah.
But what about the ordinary Kenyans just trying to live their lives amidst all of this turmoil? Yeah, it's easy to get swept up in all the drama happening in the halls of power, but some of the most telling stories from that day are the ones about regular Kenyans caught in the middle of it all, right?
Absolutely. Those are the stories that really humanize these events, you know? They show how these bigger trends impact people's day-to-day lives.
Speaking of which, did you catch that story about the guy impersonating the EACC boss? That's pretty brazen,
Oh,
right?
yeah, that one was a head-scratcher for sure. Like, who thinks of that?
Yeah, I mean, talk about audacious. For those who might not be as familiar with the acronym SOUP of Kenyan agencies, we're talking about the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, right?
That's the one. And this guy's going around pretending to be the big cheese, trying to scam people out of their money.
It sounds almost comical in a way, but then you realize this is a reflection of something much darker.
Exactly. It just shows how vulnerable people are, especially when they're struggling financially, looking for a way out, you know? It's like they're easy prey for these kinds of scams.
Sadly, it's a tale as old as time. But on a slightly lighter note, there's also that news about King Kala, the radio personality. You know, the guy from NRG.
Oh, yeah, King Kala, sure. What about him?
Seems he decided to part ways with NRG Radio.
He did. Interesting. Didn't he have a pretty big following there?
Yeah, he was pretty popular, which is why his resignation kind of caught my eye. And it's not just him. Apparently, there have been a bunch of high-profile departures from NRG lately. Makes you wonder if something's up over there, right?
Right, like, is this a sign of a bigger shakeup in the media landscape? Are people just looking for something different, you know?
Yeah, maybe it's a sign of the times, right? Like people are looking for more authenticity, more voices who are willing to actually challenge the status quo, not just toe the line.
It wouldn't be surprising.
Which brings us to a story that definitely stirred the pot, shall we say. What about this political activist, Marara Cabasso? Got himself arrested after making some, shall we say, pointed remarks at a public event.
Oh, Cabasso. Yeah, that's not exactly surprising, is it? He's never been one to shy away from a little controversy.
Understatement of the year. From what I gathered, he basically said that if those in power fall, they'll take everyone down with them, or something like that.
Yeah, he used that old saying, "Kufa dereva kukamakanga." It's basically a warning that those in power are willing to drag everyone down with them if they go down.
Subtlety isn't exactly his strong suit, is it? But in all seriousness, his arrest does raise some important questions about freedom of speech, doesn't it?
Definitely. It's like, where do you draw that line between passionate advocacy and actually inciting unrest or violence? It's a tough one.
A tough one indeed. Well, as we wrap up this roller coaster of a deep dive into October 8th, 2024 in Kenya, what are some of the big takeaways we should keep in mind?
It's been a whirlwind. We've got political intrigue with Gachagua's impeachment, economic uncertainty surrounding those interest rate cuts, and then a whole mix of social issues bubbling to the surface. I think what ties it all together is this sense of a nation wrestling with some pretty big questions.
Big questions indeed. Questions about corruption, accountability, economic opportunity, and just the power of individual voices in shaping the future.
Exactly. This one day's worth of news, it's like a snapshot of a nation at a crossroads. So as you keep following these stories, it's important to keep those bigger questions in mind.
And maybe even more importantly, ask ourselves what role we want to play in shaping that future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.